Noah's flood was not the original flood. The oldest recoverable version we have is older than Genesis, older than the Hebrew Bible in any recognizable form, and when I finally followed it back through the tablets, the museum catalogues, the excavation reports, and the translations, what disturbed me was not merely that the story was earlier, it was that its logic was different. In the version that sits behind the later retellings, humanity is not drowned because it is morally depraved. Humanity is drowned because it is too loud. The gods cannot sleep. I kept returning to that, not because it is dramatic, but because it is precise. The flood, in its earliest full Mesopotamian form, is not primarily a sermon about sin. It is a political solution to overpopulation, noise, and divine irritation. That is a very different story. And once you see that difference clearly, the later version begins to look less like a preservation than a rewrite. There is a reason this caused panic when it first resurfaced. When George Smith read the Flood tablet in the British Museum and then announced his discovery in London in 1872, Victorian audiences were not merely intrigued by an old parallel. They understood that an older text had appeared carrying a version of sacred history that did not depend on Genesis at all. Smith reportedly said he was the first man to read it after more than 2,000 years of oblivion. He was reacting to age, yes, but also to displacement. The Bible was no longer standing alone. The ground here is solid. This is not fringe material. The flood narratives of ancient Mesopotamia have been studied for more than a century and a half by Assyriologists, they're biblical scholars and historians of religion working in institutions nobody would mistake for an occult society. The British Museum houses the famous Neo-Assyrian flood tablet, museum number K.3375 from the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The Penn Museum displays CBS 10673, the Sumerian flood tablet from Nippur, dated around 1650 BCE, preserving part of what scholars call the Eridu Genesis. George Smith announced the decipherment of the Mesopotamian flood story to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London on December 3, 1872. Wilfred G. Lambert and A.R. Millard's 1969 edition of Atrahasis clarified the old Babylonian epic that had long been sitting, broken and partially misunderstood in the British Museum. Stephanie Daly at Oxford translated the text for a wider scholarly readership. A.R. George at SOAS produced the standard modern work on the Epic of Gilgamesh. Irving Finkel, also at the British Museum, pushed the discussion further with the Ark tablet. None of this is hidden. Mainstream scholarship is equally clear on another point that matters here. Most biblical scholars hold that Genesis 6 through 9 is in some sense dependent on Mesopotamian flood tradition. The debate is not whether there is a relationship. The debate is which version lies closest behind Genesis, how that relationship travelled, and what exactly was changed in transmission. Scholars such as Tikva Frymer-Kensky and others have long noted that the biblical text moralizes and monotheizes material that, in Mesopotamia, is polytheistic and structurally more disturbing. Even a careful summary from the Torah, hardly a sensational outlet, states the matter plainly. Genesis is likely indebted not just to Gilgamesh, but more deeply to Atrahasis. There are details here that matter, because they show how closely scholars have worked this material. The Penn Museum catalogue for CBS 10673 specifies that the surviving tablet is the lower third only, with 6 columns, perhaps once part of a text of around 260 lines. The British Museum record for K.3375 identifies it as the upper right corner of Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh, inscribed on both sides. These are not mythic abstractions floating free of context. They are broken physical records from known collections, with dimensions, excavation histories, object numbers, joins, and publication trails. So the question is not whether the material is real. The question is what we do with the fact that the earlier version says something later readers seem to have found intolerable. The difficulty is not absence of data, it is what we choose not to do with it. Here is the anomaly as cleanly as I can state it. In the oldest substantial Mesopotamian flood narrative, the problem is not human wickedness. The problem is human existence at scale. The Atrahasis epic says the land became crowded, humanity multiplied, the country was as noisy as a bellowing bull, and Enlil, the chief god in this sequence, says, "The noise of mankind has become too much, I'm losing sleep over their racket." Plague follows, then drought, then famine, then flood. I want to stay with that for a moment. Not wickedness, not violence in the moralized covenantal sense that later readers know from Genesis, and not a world filled with corruption before a just God. Noise, density, disturbance, a population that has become unmanageable to the divine order that created it to do labour. Humanity is too numerous, too audible, too difficult to contain. The flood is the terminal measure in a series of population checks. That is not an obscure reading forced onto the text from outside. It is the plot. And I think this deserves to be held, because once that is admitted, the later biblical version begins to look less like the original flood story and more like an ethical correction of it. Genesis preserves the ark, the birds, the mountain, the sacrifice, the preservation of animal life, the post-flood reset. But it replaces the motive. It shifts the cause from divine exasperation with human presence to divine judgment on human evil. And that shift is so clean it almost hides in plain sight. Once you notice it, whole phrases in later tradition begin to feel like insulation wrapped around something older and less stable. The story we inherited is not simply a flood memory. It is a corrected flood memory. The mainstream explanation for this is not unreasonable. Biblical authors inherited older Mesopotamian material and adapted it to Israelite theology. They monotheized it. They ethicized it. They made it speak in a different moral register. Yes, I accept that as far as it goes, but that does not close the question. Because it still leaves us with the earlier version sitting there in plain sight, telling us that one of the foundational stories of judgment in the Western tradition may have begun as something colder, less moral, and in some ways far more frightening. But before moving forward, this deserves attention. We are not talking about a small verbal similarity. We are talking about a narrative skeleton preserved with extraordinary care while the reason for the catastrophe is rewritten. The first piece of evidence is the Atrahasis text itself. In Stephanie Daly's translation of the Old Babylonian recension, after humans are created to bear the labour of the gods, population rises. Then the lines turn. The country was as noisy as a bellowing bull. The god grew restless at their racket. Later Enlil says, "The noise of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket." He sends disease. Atrahasis survives because Enki, his god, advises ritual countermeasures. 600 years pass. Enlil tries drought. Atrahasis gets instructions again. More years pass. Famine follows. So people bow in public, shoulders slouched, faces altered by starvation. In the 6th year, the text says they served up a daughter for a meal and a son for food. Then only after those measures fail to reduce or discipline humanity sufficiently, the decision turns to flood. If this is merely a mythic flourish, why is the sequence so administrative? Why does it read like escalating social control? Then comes the second piece, and for me it is the most unsettling part of the entire tradition. After the flood, the solution in Atrahasis is not simply mercy, it is management. In the damaged but still readable conclusion, Enki proposes restrictions on birth itself. Women who bear and women who do not bear. The Pasittu demon to snatch the baby from the lap. Classes of taboo women whose status will limit childbirth. This is not redemption. And it is policy after catastrophe. Tikva Frymackenski and others noticed long ago that Genesis answers this with the opposite command, be fruitful and multiply. I want to sit with that before moving on. If Genesis tells survivors to multiply and Atrahasis tells survivors they must now be throttled by infertility, infant loss and institutional celibacy, what exactly is the biblical writer correcting? The third piece is the object that forced this out of abstraction for me. K.3.375, the Flood Tablet in the British Museum. Neo-Assyrian 7th century BCE, excavated at Nineveh, probably by Hormuzd Rassam, from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library. It is not large, about 15.24 centimetres long, 13.33 wide, 3.17 thick, a clay fragment, the upper right corner of a tablet, inscribed on both sides in 2 dense columns of wedge marks pressed into the surface before firing. The edges are jagged and darkened, the face is uneven, whole stretches are missing, and yet the surviving wedges are so tightly ordered that the break itself becomes part of the experience of looking at it. It is a damaged corner carrying the memory of a whole world. Look at this if you can, because no description prepares you. It sits under glass now, almost modest, but it once lay in a destroyed imperial library after the sack of Nineveh in 612 BCE. buried for over 2 millennia, until a 19th century excavator turned it back toward daylight. And on that clay corner survives the part where Utnapishti describes the flood, the boat, the birds, the offering after the waters recede. What was this for? And one line on that same tablet still bothers me more than it should. In A.R. George's translation, when the deluge breaks, even the gods took fright at the deluge, withdrew to the heaven of Anu, and curled up like dogs. That is not the language of sovereign moral judgment. It is the language of beings who have unleashed something they cannot fully control. If the senders of the flood fear the flood, what does that do to every later telling that presents the catastrophe as assured justice? A fourth piece deepens the timeline. At the Penn Museum, CBS 10673 preserves the lower third of a Sumerian flood tablet from Nippur around 1650 BCE, with 6 columns of text, 3 on each side, about 13.3 centimeters long. It is not the full stray, it is the lower third only, but even in fragment it tells the same structure. Pre-Diluvian cities and divine decision, a warned survivor named Zusudra, a flood that lasts 7 days and 7 nights, emergence from the boat, sacrifice and eternal life. This matters because it pushes the tradition behind Gilgamesh deeper into the 2nd millennium BCE in Sumerian dress. The story is not late. The story is old even before the version most people know. How far back does the rewrite begin? And then there is the 5th piece, which is almost too familiar to feel strange until you set the texts beside each other, line by line. In A.R. George's translation of Gilgamesh Tablet 11, Utnapishti releases a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven sees the waters receding and does not return. Genesis preserves the testing of the waters with birds. It preserves the mountain landing. It preserves sacrifice after survival. Yet it preserves the logic of a chosen remnant. But it does not preserve the reason the flood was sent in the older tradition most scholars think stands behind it. Why keep the mechanics so carefully and alter the motive so completely? As I discussed before in a previous piece on scribal cultures, ancient authors did not copy the way modern people photocopy. They transmitted by selecting, reframing, polemicizing, and embedding. That is exactly what makes this difficult to dismiss. The closeness is too strong for accident. The distance in moral meaning is too strong for simple inheritance. Pull back from Mesopotamia and the pattern does not disappear. It widens. Across widely separated traditions, we keep finding the same structural grammar. A flood or world-drowning event, a divinely warned remnant, a vessel or enclosed survival space. A rationed preservation of life, a rival at elevation or safe ground, and some form of post-catastrophe reordering. Not just people once imagined floods, the same sequence, the same narrative work. Start with the Sumerian material itself, because it establishes how deep the structure runs before Genesis enters the frame. CBS 10673 from Nippur, the Eridu Genesis tablet now at Penn, preserves Zusudra receiving warning from Enki, surviving 7 days and 7 nights of storm, stepping out of the boat and offering sacrifice. It also places the flood in a world already ordered by cities and kingship. The catastrophe is not random weather. It is a reset of civilization. That is important. The flood functions as a break in managed human order followed by sanctioned continuation. It is not only destruction, it is controlled restart. And there is another common element that deserves more emphasis than it usually gets. In each case, survival depends on attention to an instruction given before the disaster. Zusudra must heed Enki, Deucalion must heed Prometheus, Manu must heed the fish, Tata and Nene must obey the warning and stay inside the cypress trunk until the rocking stops. These are not simply stories about enduring natural force. They are stories about receiving restricted knowledge ahead of collective destruction. The remnant survives because someone is told what others are not. Then Greece. In Pseudo-Apollodorus, Library 1.7.2, Deucalion is warned by Prometheus that Zeus intends to destroy the bronze race. He constructs a larnax, a chest, stores provisions, enters it with Pyrrha, floats for 9 days and nights, lands on Parnassus, and sacrifices to Zeus Phyxios, Zeus of escape, a warned survivor, a crafted survival vessel, preserved food, a mountain landing, sacrifice after the waters stop, a new humanity generated afterward. The names differ, the gods differ, the skeleton is the same. Why does a Greek compendium from the 2nd century CE still preserve that old grammar so cleanly? Then India. In the Satapatha Brahmana 1.8.1, Manu is washing when a fish speaks to him. "Rear me, I will save thee." The fish warns of a coming flood that will carry away all these creatures. Manu is told to prepare a ship. When the flood rises, he enters it. He ties the rope of the ship to the fish's horn and is drawn to a northern mountain, and after the waters subside he descends gradually. Then comes sacrifice. Clarified butter, sour milk, whey, curds placed in the waters. And from the post-flood rite comes the continuation of human lineage. Again, warning, vessel, survival, mountain, ritual after catastrophe, sanctioned renewal. And then the one that people often leave out because it complicates neat civilizational lines. The Nawar tradition preserved in the Codex Chimalpopoca in the Historia de los Soles. There Tata and Nene are warned before the sky falls. They are told to shelter in a hollowed cypress trunk. They are given 1 ear of corn each to ration, while the trunk rocks on the floodwaters. They emerge only when the rocking stops and the corn is gone. 2 survivors, an enclosed survival container, rationed food, world reset, post-flood fire and roasted fish draw divine attention and punishment. It is not identical in every theological detail, but structurally it performs the same work. A reduced remnant passes through cosmic inundation inside a bounded refuge and enters a reordered world. These are not vague parallels. This is the same vocabulary appearing independently. How does that happen? I do not mean that as a flourish, I mean it literally. How does that happen? Why do distant traditions keep returning to the image of a chosen remnant inside a constructed container carrying life across waters that erase the existing order? Why the mountain? Why the rationing? Why the post-flood offering, or fire? Why the renewed but altered human world afterward? I have covered in a previous piece how tempting it is to flatten all of this into flood myths are common because floods are common. Sometimes that is enough. Often it is not. Because common flood experience does not automatically generate the same sequence of warning, enclosure, preservation, sacrifice, and constrained restart. That is a specific literary machine. There is another pattern here, and it matters. In Mesopotamia and in Genesis alike, the flood story is attached to legitimacy. Kingship before the flood, genealogy after the flood, lines of descent, covenantal futures. The story is not merely about survival. It authorizes the world that follows. Greek myth uses Deucalion to begin peoples. Indian tradition uses Manu to anchor human descent. Nahua tradition resets ages of the sun. The flood is not just memory, it is a charter for what comes next. Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE from Babylonian materials now lost, adds another link in that long chain. His flood hero, Xisuthros, becomes yet another witness to a Mesopotamian tradition already moving across languages and empires. By the time Genesis takes shape in the form we know, the flood story has already lived several textual lives, and that to me is why the motive matters so much. If a civilization anchors its restarted world in a flood story, then changing why the flood happened changes the moral architecture of the world that follows. A flood sent because humans are too noisy implies one kind of cosmos. A flood sent because humans are wicked implies another. A flood followed by fertility restrictions implies one politics of survival. A flood followed by be fruitful and multiply implies another. The narrative frame is stable. The meaning is not. Before moving on, I want to slow this down. The repeated structure across cultures does not prove a single event, and it does not prove a single transmission chain in every case, but it does prove that certain flood stories are doing the same conceptual work with unnerving consistency. That should make us more careful, not less. So why has this not been investigated more seriously in public historical consciousness? There are legitimate reasons. Ancient Iraq has not been an easy field environment. The Gulf War in 1991, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the looting of the Iraq Museum, the destruction inflicted by the Islamic State on sites around Mosul, Nimrud, and Nebi Yunus, all of this damaged the conditions under which Mesopotamian scholarship can proceed. Funding for cuneiform work is also chronically modest compared to the scale of the archive. In 2004, after the invasion, the National Endowment for the Humanities announced cultural heritage grants for Iraq, including just $96,588 to UCLA to develop an online catalogue of cuneiform tablets at the Iraq National Museum. That is not nothing, it is also not remotely proportionate. And yet those reasons are insufficient. because the core materials in this case were not sitting in an unsafe trench outside Mosul waiting for rescue. K.33775 was in London. The Atrahasis tablets had been in the British Museum since the 19th century, but, as even mainstream summaries admit, they were not properly assembled and understood until the 1960s. More than a century. The British Museum's cuneiform holdings are often described at around 130,000 texts and fragments. Only a small percentage has been translated. The number lands heavily because it should, and 130,000. Hormuzd Rassam alone sent more than 70,000 cuneiform tablets back to London. George Smith's dramatic reading before the Society of Biblical Archaeology happened in 1872. We are in 2026. That is 154 years of public awareness that a Mesopotamian flood narrative stands behind the later biblical one. And still the broader culture usually treats this as a curiosity rather than an interpretive crisis. I am not describing a coordinated suppression. I am describing something more diffuse than that, and in some ways more troubling. It is a failure of appetite. Departments separate Assyriology from biblical studies from popular religious history, museum catalogues from mass education, literary dependence from existential implication. A scholar can note accurately that Genesis ethicizes older Mesopotamian material and move on. A museum label can say the tablet resembles Noah and leave visitors with their impression of an interesting precursor. A television documentary can marvel at George Smith tearing off his clothes in excitement and still decline to linger on what he had actually found. Not just an older flood, but a morally different flood. And I think there is also a professional instinct at work. Assyriology has spent decades fighting to be taken seriously as a rigorous discipline, rather than a supplier of sensational headlines. Biblical studies has spent decades navigating confessional expectations, denominational pressures, and the politics of public interpretation. Comparative mythology has its own history of overreach, so everyone learns restraint, understandably, but restraint, over time, can harden into a habit of looking away one sentence too early. Even where the anomaly is acknowledged, it is often depersonalized into taxonomy. Criticism, redaction history, comparative mythology, all useful, all necessary. But somewhere in that process, the central shock gets neutralized. The possibility that one of the most influential stories in religious history was deliberately rewritten to make the universe appear more just than the earlier version allowed. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying the authors of Genesis sat cynically at a table and decided to deceive anyone. I am not claiming that every flood tradition in the world derives from one historical event or one single textual ancestor. I am not saying the Mesopotamian version is therefore true in a literalist sense and the biblical version false. What I am saying is that the documented record shows a stable flood narrative structure moving from Mesopotamian texts into Genesis, while the cause of the catastrophe is transformed from divine irritation with human proliferation and noise into moral judgment on human corruption. What matters to me is that this can be said without leaving mainstream evidence. You do not need a lost archive, a suppressed confession, or an exotic theory. You need the published translations, the museum records, and the willingness to compare what they actually say. That is not speculation. That is the comparative record. It is visible in Atrahasis, in Gilgamesh Tablet 11, in the Sumerian flood material, and in the way Genesis preserves the framework while changing the reason and the post-flood social order. Whatever theological conclusions one draws after that are separate. The observation itself is unavoidable, and once I admitted that to myself, the questions multiplied faster than the answers. Why preserve the birds, the ark logic, the mountain landing, and the sacrifice, but replace the stated motive for annihilation? What are we supposed to do with Atrahasis 3.7.2 through 8, where the future of humanity is regulated by infertility, taboo women, and infant-snatching forces rather than covenantal mercy? The record does not tell us why a story so central to later moral imagination began, in its earliest full form, as a complaint about noise and sleeplessness, and I find that absence harder to explain the longer I sit with it. Why does CBS 10673 preserve 7 days and 7 nights if the later tradition wanted only the structure, not the worldview beneath it? K.3375 still sits in London as a broken corner of fired clay. What exactly did the first readers think when Utanapishti says even the gods were afraid of the flood and curled up like dogs? Why does Genesis answer Atrahasis' post-flood birth restrictions with "be fruitful and multiply," unless it is arguing against something specific? Terrifying for whom? What did the scribes think they were saving by changing the cause and not the machinery? We still do not know what the flood was for. Before I close, I want to slow down one last time. A great deal of historical work consists of deciding which differences matter and which do not. Here, and I cannot escape the feeling that the difference in motive matters more than almost anything else. A God who destroys because humans are evil is terrifying enough. A divine order that destroys because humans are numerous, audible, and difficult to manage is something colder, something bureaucratic, something that does not hate us personally and may be worse for that reason. Under museum glass, the clay looks almost weightless. Stand in front of K.3375 long enough and the object begins to do something that photographs do not. The tablet is not grand. It does not dominate a room. It asks for you to come closer. The clay surface buckles slightly where the break runs through it. The wedges are tiny, disciplined, almost calm. This fragment has outlived Nineveh, outlived Ashurbanipal's empire, outlived the sack of 612 BCE, it outlived the desert that covered it, outlived the men who dug it up, outlived George Smith, outlived the Victorian crisis that followed its translation, and it still sits there carrying a story in which the world is drowned, because existence itself became intolerable to its makers. That is the image I cannot shake. Not an arc on a children's mural, not paired giraffes, not rain as moral theatre. A broken corner of clay from a burned library in northern Iraq, about the size of a hand, bearing the compressed marks of a scribe who wrote down a flood story older than the one most people know, and harsher than the one most people would want. I think about the sequence preserved there and behind it. First labour, then human multiplication, then divine insomnia, then plague, drought, famine, cannibalism, flood, sacrifice, and afterward, a program to prevent too many people from surviving too well again. Then centuries later, another tradition inherits the frame and says, no, the flood came because humans were evil, and afterward the survivors are told to fill the earth. That is not a small adjustment. It is a moral rescue operation performed on a very old narrative. And yet the earlier story remains. It has not gone away. It sits in collections with accession numbers. It sits in translations published by university presses. It sits in museum databases. It sits in the Penn Museum in the lower third of CBS 10673. It sits in the British Museum in K.3375. It sits in the lines George Smith read aloud in London in 1872 when he realised the Bible was not alone. I do not think the most disturbing part is that the flood story is older than Genesis. By now, many people know that. The disturbing part is that the older version is not morally primitive in some vague sense. It is specifically different. It presents catastrophe not as justice but as administration. Not as a cleansing of evil but as a reduction of pressure. Once that enters the room, the later rewrite starts to look less like simple inheritance and more like a human attempt to make the cosmos bearable. And that is where I have landed, reluctantly. Not with certainty about a lost event and not with contempt for the later tradition, but with the increasingly difficult sense that scribes very far from each other and very close to us knew exactly how dangerous the older logic was. They kept the vessel, they kept the mountain, they kept the birds, they kept the survivor, they changed the reason. And if the oldest flood story survived as broken clay while its reason for the flood was rewritten, what else did we decide to bury?